Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The first time Claire set foot in the mansion, it felt like she had stepped into the pages of a Gothic novel. The crumbling Victorian structure loomed over the rocky cliffs of the coastline, its windows glinting faintly under a veil of coastal fog. Salt clung to the air, carried on the relentless ocean breeze, and the faint crash of waves echoed below. The mansion, though ornate and grand, had succumbed to the slow decay of time. Its once pristine white exterior was now marred with streaks of black and green moss, and the wrought iron gates screeched in protest as Claire pushed them open. She paused in the overgrown courtyard, staring up at the mansion's darkened windows, where shadows flickered like ghosts behind heavy drapes. "Home, sweet home," she muttered under her breath, the sarcasm doing little to mask her unease. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, delivered in a weathered envelope with her name scrawled in a shaky hand. Her grandmother, a woman she hadn't spoken to in over a decade, had died, leaving Claire the sole heir to her estate. The news hadn't stirred much emotion in her. Estranged family members rarely left legacies that brought joy. Still, curiosity, or maybe duty, had driven Claire to the remote coastal town of Ravenshaw. The townsfolk, she had noticed during the short drive-in, had a peculiar way of watching her as she passed. Their eyes lingered a little too long, their conversations halting as she approached. Now, standing before the mansion, Claire felt the weight of their stares fade into insignificance. The house seemed alive in its stillness, like it was waiting for her to cross the threshold. She adjusted her grip on her suitcase, her fingers brushing against the leather handle, and stepped inside. The interior was even more overwhelming than the exterior. Dust hung in the air, catching the pale shafts of light that struggled through grime-coated windows. The entryway was dominated by a grand staircase, its banister carved with intricate, swirling patterns of vines and flowers. The wood beneath her boots groaned with every step, a sound that seemed to echo far too loudly in the cavernous space. It was the mirrors, though, that truly unsettled her. They were everywhere. Large, ornate mirrors with gilded frames lined the walls, reflecting distorted fragments of the dimly lit hallway. Some were so old their surfaces had tarnished, creating ghostly patches that seemed to ripple when she passed. Others were so polished they gleamed unnervingly bright, capturing her movements with a sharpness that felt invasive. "Why so many mirrors?" Claire murmured to herself, her voice swallowed by the silence. The question lingered in her mind as she explored further. Her grandmother's obsession with mirrors had been one of the many peculiarities that Claire's family whispered about but never explained. As a child, Claire had visited the mansion a few times, always unnerved by the stern warnings her grandmother gave. "Never stare too long into a mirror, my dear. They see more than you realize." She had chalked it up to eccentricity back then. But now, walking through the corridors and seeing her own reflection repeat endlessly in the mirrored surfaces, Claire couldn't shake the sense that her grandmother's words had been more than a harmless quirk. In the drawing room, she found the first real evidence of her grandmother's peculiarities. A journal rested on the table, its leather cover cracked with age. Beside it lay an antique silver hand mirror, its handle engraved with intricate patterns. The room smelled faintly of lavender, as though her grandmother's presence lingered. Curiosity prickled at her. She set her suitcase down and flipped open the journal. The handwriting inside was as uneven and shaky as the letters on the envelope, but the words were legible enough. "The mirrors hold them back. Keep them in place. Never let them align, or they'll escape." Claire frowned. What could her grandmother possibly mean? Her gaze drifted to the hand mirror, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in its reflection, something that wasn't there when she looked directly. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat, but the mirror showed only her wide-eyed face. The hours passed in a blur of unpacking and unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows made her flinch. By dusk, she had explored most of the ground floor. The kitchen, the library, the parlor all filled with more mirrors, more strange reflections. She decided to venture upstairs. The second floor was darker, the windows smaller and the mirrors fewer. It felt marginally less oppressive, though the shadows seemed deeper here, the silence heavier. At the end of the hallway, she found the master bedroom. It was here that she stumbled upon the attic key. The attic door groaned as it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that led into darkness. Claire hesitated, the key still warm in her palm. Something about the attic felt wrong. It wasn't just the darkness or the cold draft that seeped down the stairs, it was a sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck, as though she were being watched. But Claire was no stranger to fear. She had spent years dismissing it, brushing it aside as irrational. With a deep breath, she climbed the stairs. The attic was cluttered with boxes and furniture draped in white sheets. The air was thick with dust, making her throat itch. But it was the mirror in the center of the room that caught her attention. It was unlike any of the others in the house. Massive and circular, with a frame carved to resemble writhing vines and staring eyes, it seemed to pulse with an energy that made Claire's skin crawl. The mirror's surface was strangely dark, as though it reflected not just the room, but something beyond. Beside it lay another journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Claire opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the hurried, desperate handwriting. The spectre lives in the reflection. It whispers lies, shows you what you fear, what you desire. It takes, piece by piece. But it can't escape, not unless the mirrors align. Her breath hitched. The journal detailed incidents of people losing themselves to the mirrors, seeing reflections that didn't match their movements, hearing voices that weren't there. Claire glanced at the dark mirror again, and this time, her reflection wasn't alone. The figure standing beside her in the mirror wasn't real. It couldn't be. But there it was, pale, hollow-eyed, and staring directly at her. Claire spun around, her heart pounding. The attic was empty, just as it had been before. Yet when she looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. It raised a hand, and for a moment, Claire thought it would shatter the glass. But instead, it pointed. Not at her, but at something behind her. Claire turned slowly, her pulse roaring in her ears. At the far end of the attic, a full-length mirror stood leaning against the wall, covered in a heavy black cloth. The journal's words echoed in her mind, never let the mirrors face each other. The night that followed was restless. Claire barricaded the attic door, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the mirror had followed her. Every time she passed a reflective surface, she caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting in the corners of her vision, shapes that dissolved when she turned to look. In her dreams, the spectre spoke to her. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, indistinct but filled with malice. It promised her freedom, power, knowledge, but only if she let it out. Claire woke to the sound of faint whispers. For a moment, she thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks of the old mansion. But as she sat up, holding her breath, she realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within the walls. The room was dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to press against her skin. A faint light seeped in through the gap beneath her bedroom door, and she stared at it, heart pounding, as the whispers grew louder. They were fragmented and indistinct, as though coming from several voices at once, weaving a web of eerie murmurs. It's the mirrors, she thought, the memory of the attic flashing in her mind. Her grandmother's journal had spoken of whispers, reflections that didn't match reality, and something lurking just beyond the glass. The logical part of her brain screamed that she was imagining it, that she was tired and overwrought. But logic felt fragile in this house. Unable to ignore the growing unease, Claire slid out of bed and padded toward the door. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet, and each creak sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. She hesitated before opening the door, unsure if she wanted to see what lay beyond. When she finally did, the hallway was empty. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the faint ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Still, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Claire decided to investigate the attic again in the daylight, hoping the oppressive gloom wouldn't seem so overwhelming. But as she passed the mirrors lining the hall, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in one of the smaller mirrors lingered for just a second too long after she moved. She froze, staring at the glass. Her reflection stared back, expressionless. Slowly, she raised her hand, and her reflection mirrored the movement. Everything seemed normal until it didn't. Her reflection's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile, though Claire hadn't moved a muscle. She stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat, and the sound of her retreating footsteps echoed unnaturally. When she blinked, the smile was gone, and her reflection was back to mimicking her. "Just my imagination," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. By mid-morning, Claire stood at the foot of the attic stairs, gripping the key tightly in her hand. She didn't want to go back up there, but the unanswered questions gnawed at her. What was the spectre her grandmother had written about? Why did the mirrors feel alive? And why had she been warned never to let them align? The attic felt colder than before, the kind of chill that seeped into her bones. The dark mirror stood exactly where she'd left it, its surface still faintly rippling, as though it were a pool of water rather than glass. This time, she approached it cautiously, clutching a flashlight in her other hand. Her reflection was there, faint and distorted, but nothing unusual happened. Claire exhaled in relief, but that relief was short-lived. The journal on the floor had been closed the day before, but now it lay open. The pages fluttered as though an invisible hand were turning them, and the whispers returned, louder now, echoing in the confined space. Claire knelt beside the journal, squinting at the handwritten text. The page it had opened to detailed an account from her grandmother. "I saw it again today, staring at me from the glass. It wore my face, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were wrong, too sharp, too hungry. It wants to come through, to take my place. I can't let it. I must keep the mirrors apart." The words sent a shiver down Claire's spine. She glanced at the covered mirror in the corner, the one she hadn't dared to touch. The journal's warnings about aligned mirrors took on a new weight, and she wondered what her grandmother had been fighting all these years. The mysteries deepened as Claire began exploring the rest of the mansion. She discovered rooms she didn't remember from her childhood visits, hidden passageways behind bookshelves, trapdoors concealed beneath rugs. The house seemed to shift and change as though it had a will of its own. In one hidden room, she found a collection of old photographs. They depicted her grandmother at various stages of her life, standing in front of mirrors. But the reflections in the mirrors didn't match her grandmother's expressions. Some smiled when she didn't, others stood still while she moved. One photo, in particular, caught Claire's attention. Her grandmother stood in front of the dark mirror in the attic, her face grim and pale. In the reflection, however, her double smiled a wide, unsettling grin. Claire's stomach churned. She couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection in the photograph was alive. The house itself seemed to conspire against her. At night, the whispers grew louder, filling the halls with an otherworldly chorus. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, and doors she'd closed would creak open on their own. One night, while exploring the library, Claire noticed that one of the mirrors was cracked. Its fractured surface distorted her reflection into something monstrous, with jagged, elongated features and hollow eyes. As she backed away, the whispers surged around her. "Let me out," a voice hissed, low and guttural. It didn't sound like it came from outside the glass, it sounded like it came from within her own mind. Claire fled the library, her heart pounding, and locked herself in her bedroom. But even there, she couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The small vanity mirror on her dresser seemed to radiate an unnatural presence, and she covered it with a towel before crawling into bed. As days turned into weeks, Claire's sense of reality began to blur. She found herself avoiding her reflection, afraid of what she might see. The mirrors in the house seemed to multiply, appearing in places they hadn't been before. A small hand mirror appeared on her nightstand one morning, though she was certain she hadn't put it there. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares of the spectre, a faceless figure with glowing eyes that reached for her through the glass. In her dreams, she was always trapped, her reflection grinning down at her as the spectre whispered, "It's only a matter of time." Claire tried to reach out to the townsfolk for help, but their reactions were unnerving. When she mentioned the mansion, their faces would pale, and they would change the subject. One elderly woman, however, gave her a cryptic warning: "Your grandmother kept the spectre at bay, but it's been waiting. It's patient. Don't let it catch you alone in the glass." The turning point came when Claire discovered a hidden basement beneath the mansion. The entrance had been concealed beneath an old rug in the parlor, and it took her hours to muster the courage to descend the narrow, winding staircase. The basement was unlike the rest of the house. It was filled with strange artifacts, candles, symbols etched into the walls, and a circle of mirrors positioned to face inward. In the center of the circle was a pile of shattered glass, glittering faintly in the dim light. The journal had mentioned this place, though not in detail. It was here, her grandmother had written, that she had trapped the spectre, fragmenting its essence into countless shards. But Claire could see that the circle was incomplete, one of the mirrors was missing, and the shattered glass seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy. The mirrors hold them back. Keep them in place. Never let them align. The words haunted her as she realized the truth. The spectre wasn't just a reflection, it was a fragmented entity, bound by her grandmother's careful rituals. But something had changed, and now the pieces were trying to come together. Back upstairs, Claire noticed the mirrors had grown more active. Her reflection moved even when she stood still, its head tilting slightly, its eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. "Break the mirrors," they urged. "Set me free." But Claire knew better. The spectre wasn't a victim, it was a predator, and it wanted out. As she stood in the hallway, staring at her reflection, she noticed something horrifying. The reflections in the mirrors weren't just mimicking her anymore, they were watching her. One by one, they began to smile. Claire's hands trembled as she turned the pages of her grandmother's journal, now almost unreadable in her cluttered study. The fire in the hearth offered little warmth against the chill seeping into her bones. The air felt charged with tension, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, reaching toward her like skeletal fingers. Her grandmother's entries, once cryptic, now carried a dreadful clarity. It grows stronger with proximity. When they align, the spectre takes shape. I've kept them apart, kept it fractured, but the cracks won't hold forever. If it escapes, it will take everything. Claire set the journal down, staring at the darkened window across the room. Her reflection stared back from the glass, dimly illuminated by the firelight. At first, it seemed ordinary, but then she noticed the smile. It was faint and mocking, the corners of its mouth curling upward in defiance of her fear. Claire looked away, her breathing shallow. The spectre wasn't just contained in the attic, it was everywhere, slipping through the cracks in the mirrors, pooling in the glassy surfaces that surrounded her. And now it was waiting for her to make a mistake. The sound of breaking glass jolted her from her thoughts. It echoed through the mansion, sharp and sudden, like a scream tearing through the silence. Claire grabbed the flashlight from her desk and rushed toward the source of the noise. It led her to the library, where she found a tall, ornate mirror shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments on the floor. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of something burning, though there was no fire. Her reflection was gone, replaced by jagged shards that distorted the room into a kaleidoscope of chaos. But what caught her attention was the figure standing in the largest remaining fragment. It wasn't her. The spectre stared out at her, its face an eerie approximation of her own but twisted, its features sharper, its eyes glowing with a predatory light. It raised a hand, and though Claire stood still, the figure in the mirror moved closer, as if pressing against the fragile barrier between worlds. "Break them all," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "You can't stop it. Let it end." Claire stumbled back, her heart pounding. The spectre's presence was suffocating, and the whispers in the air grew louder, more insistent. It wanted her to shatter the mirrors, to let it escape, but she wouldn't give in. She fled the library, slamming the door behind her, and made her way to the attic. If her grandmother had trapped the spectre before, then there had to be a way to reinforce that barrier. The journal spoke of rituals, symbols, and sacrifices, but the instructions were vague, scattered across years of desperate entries. The attic was colder than before, the air heavy with malevolence. The dark mirror at its center seemed to pulse faintly, its surface rippling like water. Claire approached it cautiously, her flashlight flickering as though the batteries were dying. Her reflection was already waiting for her in the glass, its expression blank and emotionless. But as she stepped closer, it changed. The reflection smiled. Then it pressed its hands against the glass, and Claire froze as cracks began to spiderweb across the surface. The spectre wasn't bound by the rules of the physical world. The glass shattered outward, and Claire barely had time to shield herself as shards rained down around her. But instead of cutting her, they hung in the air, suspended by some unseen force. The fragments glowed faintly, and Claire watched in horror as they began to align, floating together like pieces of a puzzle. The spectre's form emerged from the chaos, its figure shifting and flickering like static on a broken screen. It wasn't fully formed, its edges were blurred, its movements stuttering as though it were caught between dimensions. But it was strong enough to speak, its voice reverberating through the attic like a low, bone-chilling growl. "You can't keep me here forever," it said, its tone dripping with malice. "Your grandmother delayed the inevitable, but you're weak. And now you've brought me closer than ever." Claire backed away, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "I won't let you out," she whispered, though her voice trembled. The spectre laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "You already have." The spectre began to move toward her, its form shifting and flickering like a distorted video. Claire grabbed the journal from the floor and frantically searched for answers. Her grandmother had faced this entity before, there had to be something she could do. "The mirrors hold the key," one entry read. "Align them, and the spectre can escape. But scatter them, and it will remain fractured, unable to fully manifest." Her gaze darted to the attic's other mirrors. Most were covered with sheets, but the spectre had already broken through one. If it aligned with the others, it would be unstoppable. Claire's mind raced. She had to act quickly. She grabbed one of the smaller mirrors from the wall and smashed it against the floor, shattering it into countless pieces. The spectre screamed, its form flickering violently as though the act had hurt it. But it wasn't enough. The mansion began to shake, the walls groaning as if the house itself were alive and protesting her defiance. Claire stumbled, nearly dropping the journal as she made her way toward the next mirror. The spectre was close behind, its movements erratic and unnatural. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed, its voice overlapping with itself. "You're nothing but a shadow of her. A weak little girl playing at bravery." Claire ignored the taunt and smashed another mirror, sending shards flying across the room. The spectre howled in rage, its form flickering more violently, but it wasn't retreating. If anything, it seemed angrier, more determined. "You'll regret this," it growled. "You can't hide from me forever." Claire's flashlight flickered again, then died, plunging the attic into darkness. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could feel the spectre's presence closing in, its malevolent energy pressing against her like a suffocating weight. "Scatter the shards," her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Separate them, and it will weaken." She dropped to her knees, blindly feeling for the shattered pieces of glass on the floor. The spectre's whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. "Let it end," they pleaded. "You can't win. Just let go." Claire gritted her teeth and threw the shards across the attic, scattering them as far as she could. The spectre let out a deafening roar, its form wavering as though it were being torn apart. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then the attic door slammed shut, and the air grew impossibly cold. The spectre wasn't finished. The scattered shards began to glow, and Claire realized with growing horror that they were moving on their own, sliding across the floor and walls, trying to realign. She grabbed the journal and frantically searched for a solution, her hands shaking so badly she could barely read. The pages seemed to blur before her eyes, the words shifting and rearranging themselves into nonsense. "You can't stop me," the spectre said, its voice echoing from every direction. "This house is mine. You are mine." Claire's eyes landed on a single phrase in the journal, "the final sacrifice." Her grandmother had written it several times, underlined and circled, but there was no explanation. What had she sacrificed to trap the spectre before? The answer came to Claire in a flash of realization. The mirrors were a part of the spectre, but so was its connection to her. It had taken her reflection, her face, her voice, and if she wanted to banish it, she would have to give it up. Her reflection was the anchor. The thought terrified her, but there was no other way. She stood in front of the largest remaining mirror, staring at the distorted version of herself within. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her voice shook. "You can't have this world. You can only have me." The spectre's grin widened, its eyes gleaming with triumph. "Brave words," it said. "But do you mean them?" Claire took a deep breath and reached for the mirror's edge. The attic was no longer a room. It had transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and fractured reflections, a surreal battlefield where reality bent and stretched at the specter's whim. The air pulsed with an otherworldly hum, and every surface shimmered with the distorted echoes of Claire's face, some laughing, some crying, and some glaring at her with malice. Claire stood in the center of it all, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but her resolve hardened with each passing moment. She had made her decision, to face the specter, no matter the cost. The figure emerged from the largest remaining mirror, its movements smooth and predatory now, as though the scattering of shards had only delayed its inevitable emergence. It had grown stronger, its form more defined, and its resemblance to Claire was unsettlingly precise. "You can't win, Claire," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "You've already lost. You've let me in." Claire stepped back, her gaze darting to the shards strewn across the floor. They were moving again, sliding toward each other as if drawn by an invisible magnet. The specter's influence was growing, its power reshaping the attic into a prison of reflections. "No," Claire said firmly, though her voice trembled. "You're just a parasite, feeding on fear and weakness. But I'm not afraid of you." The specter laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Not afraid? Then why are your hands shaking?" It lunged forward, and Claire barely dodged in time, stumbling over a broken chair. The specter's arm extended unnaturally, fingers clawing at the air, but it hit an invisible barrier, a shimmering ripple that stopped it mid-strike. Claire realized with a spark of hope that the fragments of glass scattered around her were forming a circle, creating a temporary ward against the specter's reach. She flipped through the journal, searching for any clue, any ritual or incantation that could seal the specter once and for all. Her grandmother's words swam before her eyes. "The mirrors are the gate. The sacrifice is the key. Without the anchor, the specter cannot hold its form." The anchor, Claire whispered to herself. Her reflection, it was the specter's tether to this world. If she could sever that connection, she might stand a chance. But the specter wasn't going to wait. It began to pound against the barrier, its distorted face flickering with rage. Each strike sent tremors through the attic, and the circle of shards began to weaken, cracks forming in the shimmering ward. "Your grandmother failed," the specter hissed. "And so will you. This house is mine. Your soul is mine." Claire's mind raced. She needed to act quickly, but the only solution she could see was the one her grandmother had hinted at, a final sacrifice. If her reflection was the anchor, she would have to destroy it, but what would that mean for her? Would she lose her identity? Her soul? She glanced at the mirror in the center of the attic, the one from which the specter had emerged. It was whole, unbroken, and pulsing with an ominous light. Her distorted reflection stared back at her, its smile cruel and taunting. "You're running out of time," the specter said, its voice dripping with mockery. "Make your choice, little Claire. Fight me and lose, or surrender and let it end." Claire tightened her grip on the journal. "I'm not surrendering," she said. "Not to you." Summoning every ounce of courage, Claire lunged toward the central mirror. The specter screamed, its voice a cacophony of rage and desperation, and its form flickered violently. "You can't stop me," it howled. Ignoring its words, Claire placed her hand against the cold glass surface. Her reflection shifted, mimicking her movements with eerie precision. For a moment, she saw herself as she truly was, tired, scared, but resolute. Then the reflection began to change. Its eyes darkened, its smile twisted, and it reached out, pressing its hand against hers from the other side of the mirror. "You can't exist without me," it whispered. "I am you." Claire felt a surge of cold energy coursing through her, as if the specter were trying to pull her into the mirror. The journal slipped from her grasp, and she struggled to keep her footing as the attic seemed to spin around her. "No," she said through gritted teeth. "You're not me. You're a shadow. A parasite. And I'm going to end this." With a scream of defiance, she slammed her other hand against the mirror, channeling all her anger, fear, and determination into the act. The glass cracked beneath her palms, and the specter recoiled, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The shards of glass on the floor began to glow, their light intensifying as the mirror splintered further. The specter howled, its voice fractured and fading, and Claire felt the pull of its power weaken. But the spectre wasn't gone yet. As the mirror shattered, its energy surged outward, enveloping the attic in a blinding light. Claire was thrown backward, hitting the floor hard, and for a moment, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, she saw the spectre standing over her, its form flickering and unstable. It was smaller now, its edges blurred, but its eyes burned with hatred. "This isn't over," it hissed. "I'll always be a part of you." Claire pushed herself to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. She picked up a shard of glass from the floor and held it up, her own distorted reflection staring back at her. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. With a final, decisive motion, she drove the shard into the heart of the spectre. The spectre let out a scream that shook the very foundations of the house, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows and light. The attic trembled, and the mirrors shattered one by one, their shards disintegrating into dust. Claire collapsed to her knees, the shard falling from her hand as the spectre's presence faded. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the attic was silent once more. For a moment, Claire thought it was over. But as she looked around, she noticed something strange. The mirrors were gone, but their reflections remained, faint, ghostly images flickering in the air. And in those reflections, she saw herself. Not as she was, but as she could have been. Claire stood slowly, her legs shaking, and reached out to touch one of the faint reflections. It rippled like water beneath her fingers, and a voice echoed in her mind. "You've won for now." But the shadows never truly disappear. The reflections faded, leaving the attic empty and quiet. Claire picked up the journal from the floor, its pages now blank, as if the battle had erased its contents. She left the attic, closing the door behind her, and stepped out into the cool night air. The stars above were bright and clear, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. But deep down, she knew the spectre wasn't gone. Not completely. It was a part of her now, a shadow she would carry for the rest of her life. And as she looked at her faint reflection in the window, she saw it smile. The house was eerily quiet in the aftermath. Claire sat on the worn sofa in the living room, her legs trembling and her breath unsteady. The events in the attic felt like a fever dream, a violent, surreal blur. But the ache in her arms and the shallow cuts on her hands reminded her it was all too real. She clutched the journal, its once detailed pages now inexplicably blank. The aged leather cover was still warm against her skin, as though it retained the energy of what had just transpired. Claire ran her fingers over the cover, searching for some remnant of her grandmother's wisdom. But there was nothing left. She looked toward the hallway, where the attic door remained closed. The faint glow that had seeped through the cracks was gone, leaving only darkness. Yet, she could still feel the weight of something lingering above her, like a storm on the edge of the horizon. The mirrors were gone, shattered into nothingness during the spectre's final moments. But as Claire stood and moved through the house, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every reflective surface, windows, the glass on picture frames, even the polished surface of a doorknob seemed to catch her movement just a fraction of a second too late, as though her reflection were hesitating before mimicking her. Claire paused by the kitchen sink, leaning heavily on the counter. The moonlight streaming through the window cast a soft glow over the room, and for a fleeting moment, she felt safe. But then she glanced at the window and froze. Her reflection was there, staring back at her. But something was wrong. The reflection blinked, but Claire hadn't. Her stomach twisted as a chill ran down her spine. She turned away from the window, refusing to look any longer, and focused on her breathing. "It's over," she whispered to herself, as though saying the words aloud would make them true. But was it really over? Her grandmother's final warning echoed in her mind, "The mirrors are the gate." The shadows never truly disappear. Claire knew the spectre had been weakened, its power diminished, but she couldn't shake the feeling that its essence lingered. It had been tied to her reflection, a parasitic force that fed on fear and doubt. Even in its apparent defeat, it had left its mark on her. As the hours stretched into the early morning, Claire found herself unable to sleep. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. She sat in the living room with every light on, the journal resting on the coffee table in front of her. She thought of her grandmother, the stories she had told about the spectre, and the warnings she hadn't lived long enough to fully explain. Claire had always dismissed them as superstition, remnants of an old-world belief system that had no place in modern life. But now, she understood. Her grandmother had faced the same darkness, had fought the same battle, and had lived with the same lingering shadow. And like her grandmother, Claire would have to carry that burden. The sound of faint knocking broke her thoughts. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the tapping of a tree branch against the window. Claire's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced toward the front door. The knocking came again, louder this time. Her pulse quickened, and she stood slowly, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She moved toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. There was no response. The knocking came again, insistent and deliberate. Claire reached for the doorknob, her fingers hovering just above it. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her not to open the door. Then she glanced at the small pane of frosted glass set into the door. A shadow shifted on the other side, vague, indistinct, but undeniably there. She took a step back. "Go away," she said, louder this time. The knocking stopped. For a moment, silence filled the air, thick and oppressive. Claire held her breath, waiting for the shadow to move, for the sound to return. But instead, she heard a faint whisper, so soft she wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. "You can't get rid of me." Claire's blood ran cold. She stumbled back from the door, her chest tightening with fear. The voice had been hers, not her actual voice, but the specter's warped imitation of it. The room seemed to tilt around her, the edges of her vision blurring. She grabbed the journal from the coffee table and clutched it to her chest, as though it could protect her. The knocking didn't return, but the silence was worse. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Claire backed into the living room, her eyes darting to every shadow, every faint reflection in the glass surfaces. She felt trapped, cornered by something she couldn't see. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, the tension in the house seemed to ease. The oppressive weight lifted, and Claire felt the knot in her chest loosen. But the unease remained. She knew the specter's influence wasn't entirely gone. It had left its mark on her, a scar she couldn't see but could feel deep within. Claire made her way to the attic door, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The space was empty now, the mirrors and their shards reduced to nothingness. The faint glow that had once emanated from the room was gone, replaced by the soft, golden light of morning. She stepped inside, scanning the space for any lingering signs of the specter. But there was nothing. Yet, as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. On the floor, where the central mirror had once stood, was a single shard of glass. It was small, no larger than her palm, but it reflected the room with unnatural clarity. Claire knelt and picked it up, her fingers trembling. For a moment, the shard was cool to the touch, but it quickly warmed in her hand, as though it recognized her. She stared into the glass, half expecting to see the specter's face staring back at her. But all she saw was her own reflection, tired and haunted. Then, just as she was about to set it down, her reflection blinked. The shard slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a soft clink. Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The attic felt colder now, the light dimmer. She left the room quickly, closing the door behind her. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. It wasn't safe, not for her, and not for anyone else. By midday, Claire had packed a small bag and locked the house behind her. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the back seat, a shadow, a flicker of movement, but when she turned around, the seat was empty. The road stretched out before her, endless and uncertain. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't know what the future held or how long she could keep running from the shadow that haunted her. But she knew one thing for certain: the battle wasn't over. The specter might have been weakened, but it wasn't gone. And as she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she saw it smile.